Greetings and welcome back. In the first mini lecture on Congress, I tried to get across a few things that you should be aware of. First of all, that when I talked about the Constitution, I talked about how the founding fathers set up a system of power fragmentation. That power was fragmented with lots of checks and balances and separation of powers, and certainly that was the intent of the first lecture. So I did mention that the U.S. Congress is the most active national legislature in the world. In theory, it can govern without the president if they can get two-thirds majorities in both houses of Congress to override a veto. Told you that that's very rare. It seldom happens, although in the case of Andrew Johnson, it occurred. And so if you truly have a president that is seen as out of touch, Congress can hijack the system, although it's very rare. Congress also has the power of oversight, monitoring the actions of the executive branch, talked about the confirmation of federal judges, hearings, investigations, and the ultimate power of impeachment. Uh, Notice how that power flows both ways. Congress is the only institution that can make laws, but presidents can check them with a veto. Congress can pass a law, the president can sign it, but the Supreme Court can strike it down with judicial review. So notice the ebb and flow of power, that it goes both ways. But what I would point out is that even though there are separation of powers, even though there are checks and balances, from a constitutional perspective, Congress was supposed to be the leading and most powerful national institution of government. In the real world, the president has become far more powerful than the founding fathers would have assumed. But Congress, if you take a look at national legislatures around the world, is still a formidable institution. So that's kind of the review of last time. Today, I want to move to the last overview before I start talking about Congress as a political body. And this is this two Congresses phenomenon. And by two Congresses, what I mean is that Americans hate Congress as an institution. Underline this, star it, whatever you want. It is the least trusted national institution. Um, and I don't know why I have, even though it is the most trusted institution, I have a typographical error there. It is the least trusted national institution, even though it's the most, and that word should be democratic institution. So it's very democratic. Every 2 years, we elect the entire House of Representatives, and yet we don't trust this institution. Remember, the Supreme Court, which is the least democratic institution, is the most trusted. So that's kind of scary to me, that the institution that is the most democratic, we have the least trust in. And so in survey after survey after survey over the last 50 years, or maybe even a little bit more than 50 years, the Congress is the least trusted institution. So change that wording there. And we have this strange notion, and this notion is that even though this is an institution we despise, we think it's dominated by special interests, it's a cesspool, it's a sewer. You can go on and on and on with the things that Americans have said in these national surveys. And yet, if you take a look at Election Day, our actions run contrary to what we say, because since World War II, 92 to 93% of House members seeking re-election have won. 77 to 80% of senators seeking re-election have won. And your book addresses this, in my opinion, very, very effectively with this concept on page 308 of the permanent campaign. This notion that members of Congress are always running for re-election rather than governing. And there's a really interesting debate that I won't ask either of these names on the exam, but I want to illustrate this debate because they're two men that I really admire a lot. Morris Fiorina wrote a book many years ago called Congress, the Electoral Connection. And essentially, Fiorina had the perspective of your textbook, that congresspersons are single-minded reelection seekers, that governing is secondary, and that overwhelmingly they're there to seek reelection. That book was countered by a man named Richard Fenno, who wrote a book called Homestyle. And in this book, Homestyle, Fenno said that Fiorina had exaggerated this, that certainly people want to get reelected because you can have all the great ideas in the world to govern, but if you do not win reelection, then it doesn't matter what your ideas are because someone else is going to be sitting there in Washington instead of you. So Fenno said, of course people have to seek reelection because it is the only way to get anything done. But Fenno's investigation said that Fiorina was far too cynical. He would say that Greenberg and Page, your textbook authors, are too pessimistic. And he would say that if you take a look at this notion of the permanent campaign, that yes, it's there in order to facilitate reelection, but the vast majority of people who go to Congress go there wanting to get certain things done. Now, one of the problems of having these reelection rates at obscene rates, as I call them in the notes, is that there are no term limits on Congress. And this makes Congress a very different institution than the president. I mentioned in the presidency, remember, that presidents are limited to 2 terms or at a maximum 10 years in office. But congresspersons can be there for nearly forever. And your textbook uses the example that I gave you earlier. The longest serving member of Congress ever in American history was John Dingell, who was a member of the House of Representatives from Michigan. And listen to this statistic. It is truly staggering. This man served in the House of Representatives from 1955 until 2015. 1955 to 2015. That means that Representative Dingell served in the House of Representatives for 60 years. Now, what your book doesn't tell you is that before Representative Dingell represented that district, his father represented that district. And then when Dingell stepped down in poor health and died shortly thereafter, his wife now serves as that member of Congress. So the Dingells have represented that district in Michigan from the Great Depression to the present. And certainly for people who are fans of term limits, this is the kind of thing that they rail upon. So interesting. We don't like Congress as an institution, but somehow we think that our representative is a good representative. It's a person we can trust, and it's a person that gets things done for us. And I think there are multiple reasons for that. Your book points out some of them. In 2016, the average House incumbent, and an incumbent is merely the person who holds office at that time. In 2016, the average House incumbent spent $1.74 million defending their seat. And so I would expand upon your book. Usually, the people who are in office can outraise, especially in a House race, their opponent 4, 5, 6, 8 to 1. A challenger may have a couple $100,000 to spend, and they have $1.75 million or $2 million to defend their seat. In the Senate, the average senator defending their seat spends about $9 million. And the reason for this is that unlike House seats, and I believe that this is why senators are more vulnerable. If I ask you on the exam about House members versus senators seeking reelection, House members are a lot safer because they do not face quality opponents. And in the Senate, sometimes a challenger may actually be better known than the incumbent Senate candidate, and that's unheard of in the House. In the House of Representatives, the incumbent is virtually always better known than the challenger, unless the challenger is a war hero or has something unusual about them. But in the Senate, you may actually have a very popular governor or former governor who seeks a Senate seat. And a good example of that in this current election coming up is in Colorado, where a very popular Governor Hickenlooper, who actually ran for president. You may remember he was one of the Democratic challengers that dropped out fairly early. He actually had people approach him about dropping out of the presidential race so that he would run for the Senate seat in Colorado. And so the Senate seat in Colorado is currently held by a Republican. But Hickenlooper, A, because he ran for president, and B, because he was a very popular former governor, actually is the favorite to win. And so when your book is talking about senators often face quality opponents, that would be a good example. Obviously, your textbook was written before this election was coming up, and so there's no discussion of it. But certainly, I'm guessing in the next edition of this book, if Hickenlooper wins this seat in Colorado, which I think he will, we'll see. I mean, a whole bunch of things can happen, and maybe he has a scandal I'm unaware of. But certainly, there is a case where I expect a challenger to upset the incumbent, even though the incumbent is well funded. He's not as well known as the challenger. And so that's one of the reasons why senators are more vulnerable to being defeated than incumbents. Now, something your book doesn't talk about very much, it very briefly mentions it. I'll go into a little bit more detail. I will give you an overview of this and then go into more detail later. But I think that when people see congresspersons in other districts doing favor for their constituents, they think it's greedy, they think it's special interest, they think it's shady. But when people see their congressperson out there working for them, they think it's representation. So I would just have you scroll down in the example. The first example is Casework. This is doing a personal favor for a constituent, such as getting him or her a government check. I'll give you a good example of Casework. In my case, our congressperson back in Kentucky was approached by my stepmother, and my dad ended up in the Veterans Administration Hospital. A better example of this, and I don't think this was Casework, but my mom believes it was that her old Congressman Gary Condit wrote a letter of support for a widow's disability pension. I think my mom was clearly disabled. She had a right to that, and but my mom is still convinced that it's Condit's office that got her that check. I just think the evidence was overwhelming, and she was entitled to that. So getting someone a government check, like a Social Security check, getting a constituent into a VA hospital, something on a personal level. And this is wonderful from a congressperson's perspective, because if you do a personal favor, you not only get that person's vote, you get their family's vote, you get positive publicity. It goes through the neighborhood like an urban myth that, hey, our congressman went to battle with the government and did a favor for us and made our lives better. And no one is going to run a campaign ad saying that the congressperson should not have helped a widow get a disability pension, which is what happened for my mom, or should not have helped a veteran get into a VA hospital. In this particular case, if you were to run an ad criticizing that, you would get more people angry at you than supportive. They would say, well, of course a congressman should battle to get people a government benefit if they're entitled. So Casework is the most personal form of constituency service, and in my opinion, the most effective.